All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're talking with Dr. David Coyle from Clemson University. He is an associate professor and state extension specialist who focuses on forest health and invasive species, including threats like the Asian longhorn beetle. We're also joined by Chris Lubert, senior planner and arborist for the town of Mount Pleasant, as well as Liz Boyles, division chief with our neighborhood livability department at the town of Mount Pleasant. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. I know this is something that Mount Pleasant residents have had questions about, so we really appreciate you guys helping us break it down. I've been hearing a lot of questions about the Asian longhorn beetle locally. Can you confirm first if it's true that we've identified these beetles in Mount Pleasant?
I can, yeah. Thanks for having me on, Eric. And hey, everybody. I can confirm it is in Mount Pleasant. We found it there last summer. It was found by some of our program staff who were actually off duty just getting groceries. They happened to see some damaged trees. And of course, because that is their job, they went and checked them out. And sure enough, there were some infested maple trees there. So Asian longhorn beetle has been, backing up. It's been in South Carolina. We found it in May of 2020. It probably got here about 6 or 7 years prior to that, based on some of the research we've done. So it's been around a bit. The Asian longhorn beetle there in Mount Pleasant is a little more recent in terms of when it got there. We found it in 2025. We do also know that that population came from the one in Hollywood. So there's a definite link there. So it's likely that the beetles got there in infested material. We know the adults don't fly particularly well or far. They're kind of lazy as far as beetles go, but they are pretty adept at just hanging out in wood, which is where the larvae spend a lot of their time. So when material gets moved outside of those quarantine zones, which we established, that's how these new populations can get set up.
Okay. I know you said that the ones in Mount Pleasant were particularly found in maple trees. Are there other trees that are particularly affected?
In South Carolina and honestly in North America, they love maples by far the most of anything. They will also affect the occasional willow tree or birch tree or elm tree or cottonwood tree. But if you look at the percentages, maple is about 98% of where we find them, and everything else is kind of that other 2%. They really only go to something not maple if all the maples are kind of destroyed already.
And as far as Mount Pleasant goes, do we know kind of how widespread it is so far? Is there kind of an area that we're talking about that we know of? Is there like a quarantine zone? Do we know how widespread it is?
There is a quarantine zone, and so the quarantine zone boundary that they have that updated on the website, that boundary encompasses both kind of what I call the core area where you've got a lot of the infested trees, but then there's also a buffer zone on there as well. So if you look at the boundary as a whole, just imagine that kind of the middle part of it is where the most of the infested stuff is, and a lot of those other areas on the outskirts are just sort of buffers. But those quarantine zones are set. So there are two separate quarantine zones in South Carolina. There's the one over there in Hollywood, Ravenel, and then there's this one in Mount Pleasant. If you look on some of the websites, it's simply referred to as the South Carolina quarantine zone. So even though it's two parts, it's considered one quote unquote zone.
And so I want to talk about why this matters. So for folks who may not be familiar, why is this a problem?
Well, it's a problem for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's a federally regulated invasive species, which means whenever Asian longhorn beetle is found anywhere in the US, it is a federal issue. And this is primarily because of the damage it does to the trees. So to be clear, Asian longhorn beetle is not dangerous to people or pets. It's not going to bite you or get under your skin or anything like that. But it does affect these trees. And when the larvae feed inside the trees, the larger larvae more or less Swiss cheese the wood. So they'll chew their way through and burrow their way through. And by doing this, it makes them extremely weak. Yes, it can kill the trees eventually because it interferes with the tree's ability to move water and nutrients. But probably from a bigger perspective, it's a safety thing for us as people, because once these trees are affected, they are very much prone to breaking in windstorms, ice storms, anything like that. And that's where a lot of the issue comes, is these things sort of break and fall apart, and it's a major hazard.
And is there a certain time of year that they're going to be spreading more quickly, or is it more likely for them to be spreading at a certain time of year?
We actually have some pretty good data on the Asian longhorn beetle life cycle in South Carolina. So we know that it's May 1st. In the next probably 2 to 3 weeks or so, typically the month of May, the adults are going to start coming out of the tree. And so this is when they'll be crawling around on trees. They nibble on leaves and stems a little bit. They will lay their eggs on the tree bark. And then typically by, June or early July, those eggs will hatch. And then the really small larvae will first start feeding on the phloem, which is that green living part of the tree right underneath the bark. This is when it's really easy to see an infested tree because just because of how maples are, where those feeding spots are located, you have this dark black sap that sort of drips down the stem. It's very, very characteristic, and it looks like, what is wrong with that tree? About a month or so later, late August, September, the larvae will turn and go directly into the wood of the stem or branch. They will spend the next several months just feeding in that wood, chewing these big galleries and holes. They spend all winter there, pupate. They become a pupa in, April or so for about a month, 5, 6 weeks, and then they'll come out again next May. So the easiest time for them to move really is when they have gone into the wood itself. So any type of wood movement over fall and winter is probably the most common time for them to move. That being said, if living trees or even dead trees with beetles on them, whether it's adults or younger larvae, are moved at the right time throughout the year, they can also be transported. This is why we have those quarantine zones. One of the laws about a quarantine zone is you are not allowed to move potentially infested host material outside of it, right? So if you have infested stuff inside that quarantine zone, it can move inside there, but think of that quarantine zone as basically a big fence, and you can't cross the fence with anything that might hold ALB.
Okay, so things like discarded limbs from trees, or if you were I don't know, cutting branches off trees, things like that.
Right. If those trees are potential hosts for Asian longhorn beetle, that stuff cannot legally move outside of a quarantine zone. Now, not every tree fits that bill, right? Pines aren't counted, oaks aren't counted. That stuff can kind of go wherever. But if it's a maple or any of those other species that I listed or that are, officially listed as host trees, that stuff cannot leave the quarantine zone legally.
Okay. And so what's being done right now to manage this?
Well, one of the biggest things we do to manage this is there's a whole Asian longhorn beetle cooperative program here in South Carolina that consists of federal personnel, state personnel. We work with municipalities as well, the South Carolina Forestry Commission. And then the program contracts with Davy Tree Removal. And what they will do is they will go to where these infested trees are, cut them down, and then they chip them up. And they know through research that if you chip them to a certain point, it kills all the larvae inside. So everything is good there. But that's what's happening is Davy is working their way through, trying to get these trees down. That sounds like a fairly straightforward, go cut the trees down and you're done type of thing. While straightforward, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so we're slowly moving through both the Hollywood quarantine area and the Mount Pleasant quarantine area.
Okay. And so for property owners, what does this mean for them directly? What steps should residents be taking?
Probably the most important thing residents can do is look at your trees if you have some of these hosts. If you have maples, please take a look at them and see if you see any of the damage. I know y'all have lots of good pictures you can put online. There's lots of great stuff through Clemson, through the USDA. Look and see if your trees have anything that looks like this. There's a reporting tool online, and every report is checked out. So even if you are a little unsure of that might or might not be, please put it in there. We'll come check it out. Someone will come, look and see, and then we'll either know yes or no. That is honestly the most important thing that landowners and homeowners can do, is just report things that look suspect.
Okay. And what if someone thinks they've spotted one of these beetles? Is there a way to report that?
Yep, that's right online. The best thing you could do is catch the beetle. If you're willing and
Okay.
able to do that, please do. The second best thing is a picture. Cell phone pictures are great now. And then on that link online is a reporting thing. You just say, hey, this is where I am. I either have the beetle in hand or here's a picture of the beetle. I think it's this, and then give us a contact email or phone number, and someone usually gets out there that day for these things. We take this really seriously. So if there is a report of one of these things, you will be contacted very soon.
Okay. Um, so I've also heard kind of a big concern that we're hearing a lot is about tree loss. And maybe Chris, maybe you could talk a little bit about this. What can we share about our mitigation efforts? I know the town's working on or working with the South Carolina Forestry Commission to look at replacement options. What can residents expect as far as replanting or long-term tree recovery goes?
That's right. So we are discussing internally with South Carolina Forestry Commission and a couple other entities about some options. We don't have anything guaranteed at this point. Obviously, we didn't plan on having ALB in Mount Pleasant, so this is kind of coming as a surprise, but we're trying to organize something very quickly. But a lot of the efforts right now are coordinated with trying to eradicate this within Mount Pleasant as soon as we can. And then we're going to work and hopefully have more options. So for residents, I would say kind of stay updated, stay in touch with us. But we're definitely working on something. We just don't have anything concrete at this time. But we do want to offer some kind of replacement for residents affected. So it's definitely the goal and the intent right now.
Okay. And looking ahead, what kind of timeline are we dealing with here? I mean, there's some urgency, but this can take months and years, really, right?
It can. It's impossible to predict how long it will take. All I can say is previous infestations in the US, well, in North America, US and Canada, it's years. It's 10, 15 years or so before these things are completely eradicated. Now, to be called eradicated requires a number of years of zero being detected. So sometimes the last 4, 5, 6 years are just simply monitoring to make sure we don't find any more before it can be officially called that. But either way, it's a years long process. It's not something that's going to be done, in a year or two. It's going to be several years at the earliest.
And maybe on a broader note here, does this situation reinforce kind of the importance of planting native species?
It's important to consider diversifying your plantings as well. If you had a yard just full of maples, you would be heavily impacted versus if you had a nice, diverse yard of different species, you can kind of weather the storm, so to speak. So definitely important for residents to think about. You don't want to just create a monoculture. You don't want to just plant. I know live oaks are beautiful, but if you had tons of live oaks and something would ever happen to those, you're going to take a more significant hit there. So definitely important to use native species and also diversify your plantings.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll wrap it up with this. If there's one thing you would want Mount Pleasant, let me start that over. If there's one thing you want Mount Pleasant residents to understand about this situation, what would it be?
I think a couple things. The biggest thing to understand is these beetles are not a direct threat to people or pets, right? So they're not like, they're not going to come bite you or anything like that. The other thing to really focus on is reporting. So go take a look at the trees in your yard. Go take a look at the trees on your street. And if you see any of these types of damage, please report it. And then maybe just the last thing is have some patience. We are working as hard as we possibly can to get this big, machine that is a federal and state cooperative thing to work together. And we're trying to get done as quickly as we can.
Okay. Would anyone else like to add anything?
I've got nothing else, Liz.
I appreciate that point. It's having patience. I know that Jacob had mentioned too, with this being the time of year that the beetles tend to move if they're going to move, out of one tree, maybe into another, that he's seen information on, like suggesting that people check their pool filters. If
Oh,
you
that
have a
was in
pool,
yep.
if you have a pool, check your pool filter, because that might be one of those things that gets caught in there and you just don't even think about it because you're not used to looking for beetles in your pool filter and identifying them. But that could be a way to help us also find an area that might have these beetles in it.
Great point. And a fun fact or story, I don't know if this is probably not something I'll put up, but when we first found this thing in that Stono Ferry plantation on 162 down there, right? And as we were all, this was COVID time, so it was what, June of 2020. We all had our vests on and masks on, so we're all out there looking at trees, and residents were walking by asking, "What are you doing?" And we had a beetle, and we showed them, "Hey, we're looking for these things." They were just discovered here, and one person said, "Oh, those are the ones we see in the swimming pools all the time. We've seen them for years here." And they just, people just don't know what it was. They didn't know what it was. Yeah, just a big bug to a lot of people, right? And it was only really discovered because a lady in that neighborhood found one at her porch light, and she sent a picture to her son, who just happened to be an entomologist. And he had done his work, his PhD or postdoc work up in New York, where they had Asian longhorn beetle, and of course recognized it right away, and was like, "Mom, you got to call someone." And then that's how this all started. So lucky, but lights and pool filters is one of the places bugs are attracted to.
Yeah.
Well, this has been incredibly helpful. We really appreciate all of you taking your time to walk us through this and help keep our community informed.
Yeah, no, happy to help. If there's more you want to do, or the more I can do, let me know. If there's events you want someone at, either my shop or the Jacob shop can probably get someone there. So just keep us in the loop.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.